Every Intel processor you've ever used traces back to one architectural moment that changed everything. In 2008, Intel stopped treating the CPU as a compute island on a shared bus and turned it into the central hub for your entire system. Today, I'm breaking down every major Intel processor architecture, what actually changed and why it mattered, starting with the one that killed the front-side bus era for good, Nehalem. Before Nehalem, your CPU talked to RAM through a middleman. The memory controller lived in the chipset. Everything shared a front-side bus, and the whole setup was basically a traffic jam waiting to happen. Intel looked at AMD, who'd been running integrated memory controllers since the Athlon 64 days, and said, yeah, we should probably fix that. Late 2008, 45 nanometer process Core i7-900 series on LGA 166. 4 cores, 8 threads, 8 MB of shared L3 cache, and for the first time on an Intel desktop chip, the memory controller lived on the CPU die. Triple channel DDR3 quick path interconnect replacing the front side bus entirely. The CPU was no longer asking permission to access memory, it just did it. The result was a 15 to 20% IPC gain over Core 2 at similar clocks, plus the first iteration of Turbo Boost. The i7-920 became an absolute legend, with overclockers pushing it past 3.6 GHz on air cooling like it was nothing. Nehalem wasn't just faster, it was a philosophical shift. The CPU became the center of the universe instead of one component yelling across a shared bus. But if Nehalem laid the groundwork, what came next made people forget upgrades existed for half a decade. Sandy Bridge. Sandy Bridge didn't just launch in 2011, it created a problem Intel wouldn't solve for half a decade. Nobody needed to upgrade anymore. Built on 32 nanometers, Sandy Bridge delivered 10 to 20% IPC gains over Nehalem, hit higher clocks, and introduced a ring bus interconnect that elegantly linked cores, L3 cache, and integrated graphics on a single die. It added AVX 256-bit vector extensions and Intel Quick Sync Video, which turned hardware transcoding from a niche feature into something genuinely useful, all of this on a mainstream platform. But here's where Sandy Bridge became legend. The i5 2500K and i7 2600K could hit 4.5 GHz on air cooling routinely, and they stayed competitive for gaming well into the mid-2010s. People were running these chips 4 or 5 years later and shrugging at every new generation Intel announced. Why would I upgrade? I'm still getting 60 frames. The launch wasn't flawless. The Cougar Point B2 chipset had a SATA bug that degraded ports over time, forcing a recall. Intel fixed it quickly with the B3 stepping, and honestly, most people forgot about it within months because the CPUs themselves were just that good. Sandy Bridge established a performance floor so solid that subsequent generations couldn't justify the upgrade cost, which meant all those dollars went to GPUs and SSDs instead. Intel accidentally made its own future products feel optional. If you think that plateau was frustrating for Intel, wait until you see what Haswell tried to do about it. Intel looked at the desktop performance chart, looked at the mobile battery life chart, and decided the second one was more interesting. Which, if you're a desktop enthusiast in 2013 staring at a 5 to 10% IPC bump over Ivy Bridge, feels like a personal insult. Here's the thing, Haswell wasn't built for you. The i5 4670K and i7 4770K launched on LGA 150. Still 20 2-nanometer Tri-Gate, still 4 cores, still perfectly fine for gaming. But the real engineering went somewhere else entirely. Intel pulled the voltage regulator off the motherboard and shoved it directly onto the die, a fully integrated voltage regulator, FIVR, giving the chip granular control over its own power delivery, rapid transitions between power states, package C6 and C7 sleep states that dropped idle power to almost nothing. The result? Ultrabooks that could actually last all day. Thin and light laptops went from a compromised novelty to a legitimate primary machine. Haswell enabled that explosion. On the instruction side, AVX2 brought 256-bit integer SIMD operations, and FMA3 added fused multiply add, both meaningful for workloads that could use them. And then there was TSX, Intel's hardware transactional memory extension, which launched with great fanfare and was promptly disabled via microcode update because it didn't actually work correctly, which is, not ideal. Desktop overclockers found the FIVR and thermals somewhat limiting compared to earlier chips. The generation felt like Intel saying, we've got bigger plans than your benchmark scores, and they did. They were building the laptop future, but if Haswell was the quiet pivot, what came next was the architecture Intel got stuck on for half a decade. Skylake. Here's the thing about Skylake. It's not a bad architecture, it's actually a pretty good one. The problem is that Intel liked it so much they decided to use it for half a decade straight. Launched in 2015 on 14 nanometers, Skylake brought the i5-6600K and i7-6700K to the LGA Wellnum 51 socket, and on paper it was a clean, competent upgrade. You got about 5 to 10% IPC improvement over Haswell, DDR4 support on mainstream desktop for the first time, speed shift for snappier frequency adjustments, and SGX secure enclaves for sensitive computations. Intel also ripped out the fully integrated voltage regulator, handing power delivery back to the motherboard, which simplified thermals and made overclockers reasonably happy. None of that is what Skylake is remembered for. Skylake was supposed to be one step in TikTok, a new architecture on 14 nanometers, followed by a 10 nanometer shrink, followed by a new architecture on 10 nanometers, normal stuff, except Intel couldn't get 10 nanometers working at volume. So Skylake just stayed. The same core design underpinned Kaby Lake, then Coffee Lake, then Comet Lake. Years passed. The memes about 14 nanometer plus started here, and they never stopped. So Skylake exists in this weird dual legacy. It's a solid workhorse that proved adaptable enough to scale across multiple generations of products. It's also the architecture that symbolizes a stalled roadmap and the beginning of Intel's most vulnerable era, which is, not ideal. But if you think reusing the same cores with a fresh coat of paint sounds frustrating, wait until you see what Intel did when AMD actually showed up with competition. Coffee Lake. For years, Intel sold you 4 cores and acted like that was the ceiling of mainstream computing. 4 cores, 8 threads, slight clock bump, new motherboard, that was the upgrade cycle from 2011 to 2017. 6 years of the same core count at the top of the mainstream stack. Then AMD launched Ryzen and everything changed overnight. Coffee Lake hit in 2017 as Intel's 8th generation, and it was the most transparent competitive panic response in CPU history. The i7-700K delivered 6 cores and 12 threads for the first time in a mainstream i7, with turbo frequencies pushing past 4.7 GHz. The i5 jumped to 6 cores without hyper-threading. Quad cores got shoved down to the i3 tier where they belonged, all on 14 nm++, because Intel still couldn't get 10 nanometers out the door. Here's the thing. The IPC was basically identical to Skylake. They just finally stopped sandbagging core counts because AMD forced their hand. Love that it took competition for consumers to get what they should have had years earlier. Coffee Lake refresh pushed further with the i9-9900K, cramming 8 cores and 16 threads into the mainstream socket, running hot and fast and hungry for power. But here's where the community lost its mind. Coffee Lake used the same LGA1151 socket as Skylake and Kaby Lake, physically identical pins, yet Intel required brand new 300 series motherboards. Modders proved older boards could run these chips with modified BIOS files. Intel pointed to power delivery requirements. Enthusiasts pointed to their wallets and called it exactly what it looked like. But if Coffee Lake was Intel squeezing 8 cores onto a familiar design under pressure, wait until you see what happens when they try to squeeze out 10. Comet Lake. By 2020, Intel had been shipping variations of the same Skylake core design for 5 years. Rather than admit defeat and wait for a new architecture, they just kept pushing. The i9-10900K is what happens when engineers look at a 14 operating process and say, what if we simply refuse to stop? 10 cores, 20 threads, a single core boost of 5.3 GHz. On paper, genuinely impressive. In practice, your power bill noticed. Here's the thing, under sustained all-core loads, this chip pulls over 200 watts. That's not a processor, that's a space heater that occasionally runs games. Most motherboards shipped with Intel's power limits completely unlocked, which meant your 125 watt TDP chip was casually drinking 250 watts like it was nothing, which is, not ideal. Intel also introduced thermal velocity boost, which is basically the chip going, hey, I'm not literally on fire right now, so I'll clock up another 100 MHz. Opportunistic frequency scaling based on not being too hot. That's the innovation, and somehow, despite AMD already shipping PCIe 4.0 on desktop, Comet Lake launched without it in 2020. I don't know what to tell you, but strip away the memes about 14nm plus butts and the absurd thermals, and Comet Lake was genuinely fast. That 5.3 GHz single-core boost kept it competitive where it mattered most. It just achieved that speed the same way you'd win a drag race by strapping a jet engine to a shopping cart. Technically impressive, structurally questionable, this was the absolute ceiling of what Skylake could do, the final boss of 14 Neon, and it went out swinging. But if Comet Lake represents the end of brute force scaling, what comes next is the most radical redesign Intel had attempted in over a decade: Alder Lake. For 5 years, Intel's answer to every problem was the same: take Skylake, add more cores, crank the voltage, and pray the cooler holds up. Alder Lake is what happens when they finally admit that strategy has an expiration date. 12th Gen launched late 2021 on Intel 7, the rebranded 1090 UEMIA SuperFin process with a completely new socket in LGA White 1700. But the socket isn't the story. The story is that Intel looked at what ARM had been doing with Big Little for years and said, yeah, we're doing that now, on x86, on desktop. Nobody had tried this at scale in the PC space, and honestly, a lot of people thought it wouldn't work. The core i9-2900K pairs 8 Golden Cove P-cores with 8 Gracemont E-cores, giving you 16 cores and 24 threads. P-cores handle your game, anything latency sensitive. E-cores quietly manage background tasks, all the stuff that used to steal cycles from your foreground workload. To keep this from devolving into a scheduling nightmare, Intel introduced Thread Director, a hardware-level system that feeds real-time workload data to the OS so it knows which threads go where. And here's the thing, it actually worked. Alder Lake didn't just close the gap with AMD, it retook the single thread and gaming performance crown outright. The platform also brought DDR5 support alongside DDR4, plus PCIe 5.0 for select lanes, first desktop platform to offer either. This is the most fundamental rethinking of Intel's mainstream architecture since Nehalem, and unlike the 14 nanometer era of incremental core count bumps, this one required the entire software stack to cooperate. But if Alder Lake proved the hybrid concept works, Raptor Lake was about finding out just how far you can push it. Raptor Lake, Intel looked at Alder Lake's hybrid formula and said, what if we just doubled the small cores and called it a day? And honestly, it worked better than it had any right to. 13th Gen launched in 2022, still on Intel 7, still on LGA 1700, still rocking the same hybrid architecture, but the flagship i9-3900K took things to a genuinely absurd level. 8 Raptor Cove P cores paired with 16 Gracemont E cores, 24 cores, 32 threads, turbo clocks pushing up to 5.8 GHz. The P-cores were refined Golden Cove variants tweaked for better frequency scaling, which is a polite way of saying Intel squeezed every last drop of clock speed out of silicon that was already running hot. Like Aaron, cache sizes got meaningful bumps across the lineup, and DDR5 support climbed higher as the memory ecosystem finally matured beyond its awkward early phase. The strategy was clear: don't redesign the wheel, just bolt more wheels onto it and spin them faster. Here's where it gets weird though. In 2023, Intel launched 14th Gen Raptor Lake Refresh. Same architecture, same process node, same socket, marginally higher clock speeds. That's it. That's the generation. Calling it a refresh would have been generous, calling it a rebrand would have been accurate. Calling it a new generation was optimistic marketing. The i5-13600K and i7 13700K were genuinely excellent processors, but slapping a 14th Gen sticker on identical silicon with a 100 mHz bump represents peak naming fatigue. At some point, the number on the box stops meaning anything, but if iterative refinement on the same node felt like squeezing blood from a stone, wait until you see what happened when they finally changed everything about how a CPU is built. Meteor Lake. For over a decade, Intel built every client CPU the same way. One slab of silicon, one process node, everything etched together on a single monolithic die. Meteor Lake throws that entire philosophy in the trash. Shipping in late 2023 as the first Core Ultra Series 1 processors, Meteor Lake is Intel's first mass-market disaggregated client chip. Instead of one die, you get multiple tiles, each manufactured on whatever process node makes the most sense for its job, all stitched together using Foveros 3D packaging on a shared base die. The compute tile sits on Intel 4, their first EUV-based process. The GPU tile, fabbed over at TSMC on N5, different fabs, different nodes, same package, which is, kind of a big deal. On the CPU side, you're looking at Redwood Cove P cores and Crestmont E cores, continuing the hybrid approach, but with architectures tuned for efficiency. There's also a dedicated NPU baked in for AI workloads, making Meteor Lake the chip that officially kicks off Intel's AI PC era, whether software actually actually knows what to do with that NPU yet is a different conversation entirely. The GPU tile is derived from Intel's Arc discrete graphics architecture, delivering a genuine leap in integrated graphics performance, not marginal improvements. A fundamentally different class of iGPU. Here's the catch though, Meteor Lake is almost exclusively a mobile play. Laptops got it. Desktop enthusiasts? They gotta watch from the sidelines while Raptor Lake kept holding the fort. Think of Meteor Lake less as a performance crown and more as a technology demonstrator. It proves the chiplet approach works for client silicon, it proves Intel can mix and match fabs in a single package, and it sets the table for everything coming after. But if Meteor Lake is the proof of concept, Arrow Lake is where Intel tries to turn that concept into a desktop reality. Arrow Lake. Here's the thing about Arrow Lake. Every generation we've talked about so far, from Nehalem through Raptor Lake, they all share one fundamental trait. They're all built on FinFET transistors, the same basic transistor structure powering every Intel processor for over a decade. Arrow Lake throws that in the trash. Core Ultra Series 2 introduces two technologies representing the biggest change to how Intel builds a transistor since FinFET itself. The first is RibbonFET, Intel's gate-all-around implementation. Instead of a fin with the gate wrapped around three sides, RibbonFET uses stacked horizontal ribbons with the gate surrounding the channel on all four sides. Better electrostatic control, better scaling, better efficiency. The second is PowerVia, which moves the entire power delivery network to the backside of the wafer. Power wiring underneath, signal wiring on top. Zero competition between the two. That's not a minor tweak, that's ripping up the foundation and pouring a new one. On this new manufacturing base, Arrow Lake drops in Lion Cove P cores and Skymont E cores, both designed from scratch to capitalize on what Intel 20A enables. This chip is also Intel's full platform reset on desktop, new socket, new motherboard, new everything, DDR5, PCIe 5.0, NPU integration, tile-based disaggregated packaging, all aimed squarely at desktop and mobile simultaneously. And here's why this matters beyond specs. Arrow Lake is the proof of concept for Intel's entire 5 nodes in 4 years manufacturing recovery plan. If RibbonFET and PowerVia work at scale, Intel's back. If they don't, well, that's a conversation nobody at Intel wants to have. But if you think Arrow Lake is ambitious, well, wait until you see what Intel does when they remove the desktop entirely from the equation and go all in on mobile efficiency. Lunar Lake. For over a decade, Intel designed desktop chips first and then shaved them down for laptops. Cram the same cores into a thinner package, slap a lower power limit on it, call it a day. Lunar Lake flips that entire philosophy on its head. This is a processor built from the ground up for thin and light laptops and fanless devices. Not adapted, not scaled down, designed for them. The compute tile is manufactured on TSMC's N3 node, which is notable because Intel is openly handing its most efficiency-critical silicon to an external foundry. That's not a concession. That's a strategic choice. You use whatever process gets you the best performance per watt, period. The core configuration reflects this mobile-first thinking. Fewer P cores than you'd see in a desktop part. Heavy emphasis on E cores and power states tuned so aggressively for idle efficiency that the chip essentially sips power when you're not actively pushing it. The whole architecture is optimized around the reality that laptops spend most of their time doing very little, and the silicon should reflect that. Then there's the NPU. Lunar Lake's neural processing unit posts significantly higher TOPS ratings than Meteor Lake, designed to handle on-device AI workloads without waking up the power-hungry CPU or GPU cores. Whether that matters today is debatable. Whether it'll matter in 2 years is considerably less debatable. Here's the thing. Lunar Lake is Intel's direct answer to a question that's been haunting x86 for years. Can it match ARM efficiency in laptops? Apple Silicon proved that building mobile-first produces absurd battery life. Intel watched that happen, took notes, and Lunar Lake is the response. Not a desktop chip in a laptop costume, a laptop chip that knows exactly what it is. But if Lunar Lake is Intel optimizing for the present, what comes next is Intel betting on the future. Panther Lake? This is where Intel's entire post-FinFET vision either clicks into place or slams face first into reality. There is no in-between. Panther Lake, expected as Core Ultra Series 3, is built on Intel 18A. That's the second generation gate all-around node, refining both RibbonFET and PowerVia, after Arrow Lake already introduced them on 20A. Think of Arrow Lake as the prototype run. Panther Lake is where the manufacturing stack is supposed to mature and start delivering compounding gains. pains. First gen growing pains ironed out, yields improved, design teams finally comfortable with the new transistor physics. The architecture itself continues everything Intel has been building toward. Hybrid cores, tile-based disaggregated design, expanded NPU, beefed up integrated graphics. Both desktop and mobile segments are targeted, with the headline promise being substantial performance per watt improvements over prior Core Ultra generations, which, if true, would mean Intel's entire strategy of breaking the monolithic die into specialized tiles on optimized process nodes is finally paying dividends at scale. But here's the honest truth. The evidence base is thin. Almost everything we know comes from roadmaps, investor slides, and architecture day promises. Detailed microarchitecture specs, SKU breakdowns, actual benchmark numbers, none of that exists yet. We're working on faith and trajectory. And that trajectory matters because Panther Lake represents Intel's play for the latter half of the 2020s. AMD isn't slowing down. ARM-based chips are eating into laptop and even desktop markets. Apple's custom silicon proved that vertical integration works on Lyra. The question isn't whether Panther Lake will be good, it's whether a disaggregated AI-accelerated x86 platform can remain the default in a world where the competition has never been stronger. I don't know the answer, nobody does yet, but that's what makes this era worth watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.